Hello, last session. Thank you for having me here today on this beautiful, vibrant campus in this metropolis, in this country, as part of this conference about libraries and openness. I was honored to have been invited, and I'm honored to be part of this roundtable on the open library and communication with communities. This event and your invitation have been humbling experiences for me. I'm grateful to the organizers, to the presenters and attendees, to the live translators, and to participants in my roundtable for this opportunity. I work as the Digital Scholarship Librarian in the Office of Scholarly Communication at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. Texas A&M is a large public research university, though with minuscule enrollment by UNOM standards, only around 65,000 students. I recently wrapped up work as a project team member for the already computational collections as data project funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services in the United States. And I was one of the founding editors of the DHMLib project. In these roles, I've spent a number of years thinking about and working on issues related to libraries and digital humanities, scholarly publishing, humanities data, openness, and communities. Prior to becoming an academic librarian, I worked as a researcher and as an assistant to other researchers, focusing most recently on the antagonistic symbiosis between capitalism and democracy and the effects of rising income inequality in the United States. And I mention this, my pre-librarian life, my archaeology, because I find myself returning to the ideas that so dominated my research in those years, framing questions of power, governance, and decision-making, even as I look at an open library. And because, as I'm thinking more about communities and readers, populations, and design, I'm returning to another theme of my education, the tension between the universal and the particular. I think one theme that I've heard over these past three days is that we're all grappling with a balkanized system or systems of openness and access. As librarians, we administer and we are frustrated by systems that limit access to our own affiliated users. We gain additional access at the consortial level, at the regional level, the national level, and at the level of shared language. The decision of what is published openly is sometimes made at the individual level or the institutional level through national policy. Norms are perpetuated at those levels, but also through communities of practice and disciplines. The drivers of openness are individual, institutional, national, regional. Motivations are self-serving or altruistic. All of these are deeply tied to resources. And yet we still hold forth an ideal of a potentially seamless, international, open access. Acting in these systems as a librarian, the temptation may be to increase our own digital skills or to build a better tool. But as I see it, the problem and the solution ultimately appear to be more social and political than technical. And even the tools that we build, such as aggregators or publication request buttons, rely on and can be defeated by gaps in human participation. There is so much ground to cover on this topic of communities and communication with the open libraries, and I've chosen today to first encourage greater precision when invoking communities, and second, to consider the implications of designing for particular or universal users, or ideas of particular or universal users. And I'll be presenting the already computational collections as data project as an example. That project served in some ways as a repudiation of established best practices for digital collections and a call for new organizational cultures. It also deployed a very specific model of engaging and encouraging the formation of a community of practice and of cultivating an awareness of particular users and uses. So because I'm coming from the digital humanities, I thought I should bring a little bit of humanities in. And I've stolen the title of my talk from William Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, as a reminder of the importance of interpretation. As Shakespeare wrote of the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Put another way, and to quote the American author Cynthia Ozick, it's what Isaac Bashevis Singer means when he says that every writer has an address. Everyone is born into a civilization, and if you want to live the life that can best bring you into a sense of being a civilized person, then you have to seize it through your own culture. This translates, in 2019 speak, into an emphasis on positionality and awareness of your own biases as a researcher. Positionality comes from the social sciences and has gained traction in the library profession in the United States through calls to acknowledge that libraries, archives, and museums are not neutral institutions, and that staff within those institutions do not and cannot act neutrally. I am not the first person to notice a lack of precision around the use of the term community. I organized and moderated a panel on this topic 1 year ago at the Digital Library Federation Forum, and there I quoted Jarrett Drake at the time, who had called on archivists to, quote, shift their paradigms away from the fictive notions of local and community-based and towards a more radically precise and politically liberatory language. A more general critique published last year in the New York Times by Karina Chacano blasted the feel-good suggestion of the term community and its application across distinctive groups. She wrote, people who interact are a community. People who don't interact but share some quality or belief become a community. People who are lumped into communities by other communities are communities. Community makes everything sound better. One of the challenges of submitting your slides in advance is you have ample time to regret some of the things that you have included. So I'm going to put a little asterisk next to this. I want to talk about how community as a term and a concept has really gained such strength and foothold in the United States, and what it means that it's done so in that context. So here's the curious thing about the sudden dominance of community as a framing in the United States. Gerhard Hofstede's influential, if very flawed, that's the asterisk and the warning, cultural dimensions theory, which he developed based on his analysis of behavioral data from workers at IBM around the world, posits 6 dimensions of national cultures: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism or collectivism, masculinity or femininity, see the flaws, long or short-term orientation, and indulgence restraint. The individualism collectivism dimension considers, quote, the degree to which people in a society are integrated into groups. On the individualist side, we find cultures in which the ties between individuals are loose. Everyone is expected to look after himself and his immediate family. On the collectivist side, we find cultures in which people from birth onwards are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, often extended families, that continue protecting them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty and oppose other in-groups. According to cultural dimensions theory, the United States is not just a highly individualistic society, it is the highest scoring individualistic nation. Additionally, and based on much more robust research, scholars such as Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal have documented the increasing political polarization in the United States. And as many others have documented, income inequality is rising precipitously. In the United States, when we talk about community, we are doing so against the backdrop of a fractious political context, against a failure of community. This is the setting for increasingly idealized invocations of communities. Community is a slippery word defined by different groups, including different disciplines and practitioners, according to their own organizing principles. It's one of my professional goals to dig into the language and the suggestion of community and better understand what we intend or mean when we use the term community in the context of digital libraries and collections. There are real needs, considerations, and users for the open library, and when we talk about community in this gauzy way, I think we run the risk of eliding those real users and of bubbling our own goals as stewards and facilitators. Specificity around community can help those working to achieve open libraries refine their approaches and also acknowledge and understand who isn't being served and why. In encouraging the specificity, I'd like to make 2 suggestions. First, not all groups of people constitute communities. Thinking of those who use, contribute to, benefit from, or are harmed by our open libraries as communities runs the risk of erasing our particulars, of assuming a community of property, values, or ideals and identities that may not really exist. Second, communities, of course, are real. I don't mean to suggest that there aren't communities. And there are many different types of communities, but it is rare for any group of people, even those joined by common goals into a community, to represent absolute consensus. There are different models of governance and models of function for communities. There are power differentials. So now that you've absorbed all this weight around the idea of communities, what is the alternative? What's the alternative to this term, to this concept? How else can we identify groups or types of people who contribute to, use, or are represented in open libraries? In the Communities of Practice literature, specifically a 2001 article in Organization Science by John Seeley Brown and Paul Duguid, there's an interesting distinction made between communities and networks. Writing more recently in her excellent volume, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, Wendy Chun argues that, quote, networks have emerged as a universal concept, resonating across disciplinary and political divisions because they encapsulate neoliberal collectivity. As I've included on the slide, networks are based on use values, a series of interconnecting and connected use. Since you in its plural mode still addresses individuals as individuals, networks are very different from communities, which create a new identity, a we, from what is held in common. The heterogeneity of both the open library and its existing and potential users is staggering. Part of the appeal of exhortations to serve communities comes, I think, from very real desires for the dizzying array of materials in these libraries to be useful and findable for every book to find its reader, but also as an attempt to classify, improve, and scale approaches to access that have been thrown somewhat into chaos by the incredible potential of the open library to try to find commonalities. One of the major challenges when working with open libraries is the introduction of uncertainty. We've taken publications that were likely to be read by scholars within their fields and perhaps circulated out to students or policymakers or journalists or other interested parties in the general public or civil society, and we've made them available online. They're indexed by commercial or library-built search engines and interfaces, and suddenly the identities and interests of our users, potential and actual, are thrown open to great possibility. Open libraries, digital libraries have many different modes of interaction, including the expectation that users will find their way to relevant materials through these commercial search engines like Google, or that they will browse and take suggestions, offering their feedback on platforms and portals that forefront the experience and suggest opportunities for exchange. Nanabanda Thilstrup, in her recent publication, The Politics of Mass Digitization, argues that mass digitization presents a new political cultural memory paradigm, one in which we see strands of technical and ideological continuities combined with new ideals and opportunities. She observes the way that mass digitized collections, such as Google Books, Project Gutenberg, and Europeana, are constructed and conceived. And I think this reinvokes ideas of communities and networks. She identifies distinctive institutions and stakeholders involved in our experience of these open libraries. Among many other fascinating considerations, Thilstrup reminds us that the user's experience of the open library is often personal and subject to the perpetual calculatory activities, the eye of surveillance capitalism, that tracks usage and offers computationally honed personalization. I've promised a specificity of community and openness today, so now I'll turn to something of a case study approach and talk about the Always Already Computational Collections as Data project. This project engaged practitioners, researchers, teachers, and other stakeholders with a goal of developing a common framework for implementation. In early 2016, when Thomas Padilla, Lori Allen, Stuart Varner, Elizabeth Russi-Roque, Hannah Frost, and I submitted a grant proposal to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we framed collections as data as a need expressed by researchers, students, journalists, and others to access library and cultural heritage collections not in page turners or through single item view interfaces, but as data, with full access to text or images or descriptions that would enable computational analysis. I should mention that scholarly publications were certainly included in this project scope. For example, we included an effort from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to make their theses and dissertations accessible as data for text and data mining. But I would say that cultural heritage collections really dominated in many of the examples that we pulled. There has been a surge of interest recently in collections as data, coinciding with, and in some cases catalyzed, by the Always Already Computational project. But even in 2016, there were impressive and inspiring collections as data implementations, typically either at a very large scale, often through national libraries like the KB, the British Library, or ambitious museums seeking to make their full collections computationally accessible, or smaller pilot scale, including data from single collections that were posted to GitHub or on institutional or project websites, or available by request. Much of this progress benefited from digital humanities efforts that formulated texts as humanities data, like the Text Encoding Initiative. Back in 2016, writing the proposal, our project team saw the need for solutions that relied on studying users of collections as data and documenting and considering existing collections as data implementations as the basis for developing use cases, personas, and functional requirements. We envisioned an adaptable set of documents for collection stewards to guide local implementations. We embarked on an ambitious program. We hosted 2 national forums on collections as data. The project team presented at least 17 conferences. We launched a listserv for exchange, back to that network of practice, built a Zotero library of relevant publications and projects. The major output of the project was a set of deliverables that comprise a collections as data framework, and I'd encourage you to check these out on our project website and also on Zenodo. You should be able to locate it through the work cited on my slides or online, and there's also a URL to the project on this slide. So some of these resources are documentary in nature, describing an implementation in detail, and others, such as the position statements and the Santa Barbara Statement on Collections as Data, make explicit arguments about key questions, issues, and considerations, prompted by provisioning collections as data. Our set of user personas falls somewhere in between, relying on research without seeking to be prescriptive. We found ultimately that institutional context and the variety of user needs made a prescriptive set of functional requirements impossible, or at least premature. And together, these resources out of our project document extant experience and share lessons learned from those who have implemented collections as data, suggesting paths into the work. They also assert a great deal of difference in the particulars of implementation, clustered around the common ground mapped out by the Santa Barbara Statement. We held our first national forum in Santa Barbara, California in the spring of 2017. Invited participants were asked to contribute position papers, which we published online. And after the forum, intent on provisioning access to these long-form positions, as well as our extensive notes from various group exercises, Project PI Thomas Padilla put together a collections as data idea generator that, when refreshed, provides you, the viewer, with a collections as data snippet. So these are little pieces from these much longer position statements and notes. And I just wanted to bring a few of these forward for discussion. So in his position paper, Dr. Matthew Lincoln brought out a number of core design challenges to collections as data work by characterizing some of the overarching preferences of 3 important actors in collections as data implementations: the librarian curator, the historian, and the machine. This is just one snippet from that larger piece. But essentially, he writes that the librarian favors data that is standard, and the desire is to forget enough specifics about the collection in order to produce data that references the same vocabularies and thesauri as other collection data sets, and the librarian's generalization aims to support access by many different communities of practice. Sort of a generalization of how a librarian might approach collections as data in terms of the need for standardization. The historian, on the other hand, favors data that is rich, replete with enough specifics that they may operationalize that data in pursuit of specific research goals. The historian, and he warns us, appropriately, no 2 historians will agree on what that context should be. And finally, the machine favors data that is structured, amenable to computation because it is produced in a regularized format, whether as a documented corpus, a series of relational tables, or in another form. Tanya Clement points to a challenge and a gap in collections as data work, specifically that one barrier to an approach that treats cultural heritage collections or corpora of scholarly publications as data is that most humanists and librarians are ill-prepared to work with data. And finally, the observation from one team that libraries aren't here to work for everyone. I selected these 3 snippets because they're interesting and a little sharp, a little spicy, as the last panel said. They try to address or group commonalities in institutions and professional roles, and they see the universal as either somewhat irreconcilable with that or requiring extensive negotiation. They note gaps and points of compromise, but they're not hopeless, they're clear-eyed. They align nicely with, I think, some of the challenges, commitments, actions call in this roundtable. Members of the core project team wrote the Santa Barbara Statement on Collections as Data after that first national forum in 2017. The project team, drawing on our participants' position statements, our notes, and our own experiences, distilled and derived some core principles, which we published in the form of this Santa Barbara Statement. We workshopped the statement at a number of professional conferences. We posted it to our website. We asked broadly across the field for feedback, and here's a screenshot of a version we hosted using the Hypothesis Annotation tool in an attempt to invite open peer review of this first version. There were a few big jumps between the 2 versions of the Santa Barbara Statement. In the first version, we suggest that the needs of specific communities inform collections as data development, but over the course of a year, we sharpened that assertion. It became collections as data designed for everyone, serve no one. Specific needs inform collections as data development. These needs may be commonly held by particular user communities. Rather than assuming these needs or imagining these communities, stewards should be intentional about who their collections are designed for, work to lower the barriers for use for the people in those communities, and continue to assess these needs over time. Thank you. Where researchers permit, multiple approaches to data development and access are encouraged. Behind the scenes in our many notes about revising the statement, a project team member recorded that participants in a 2017 workshop who scrutinized the statement critiqued the first iteration of this principle as, quote, a vague statement of a very important problem, asking, who is the community? Who speaks for the community? One of the goals of Always Already Computational in inviting documentation, exchange, and reflection among those currently practicing collections as data and those considering doing so was to formalize an epistemic culture of collections as data and invite a network of practice. The project team realized that expressing shared definitions of collections as data work and shared values was fundamental to this effort, and that guided our publication of the Santa Barbara Statement. I only recently realized that our claim that collections as data designed for everyone, serve no one, parallels critiques of universal design. Universal design, if you haven't encountered it, is an approach forged in architecture and later extended to product design, digital environment and technologies, services, and other realms, and you should definitely look it up, it's very interesting. So one of the things that we released under this project were these collections as data personas. They're also available on our website. And this was an attempt to provide a particular way into some of the users and use cases. If you'd like to talk to me about persona development and potential application, I'd be happy to do so. It's been really interesting to see the impact of these personas. They've been taken up by some projects. And we recently learned that the National Center for Advancing Transatlantic Science at the National Institutes of Health in the United States found inspiration in our personas and developed their own evidence-based persona profiles for translational science. So this is sort of moving across spheres. I'm just going to quickly wrap up. So open libraries represent extraordinary collections of scholarly and cultural objects that in their scope and range can be difficult to find, decipher, and use. Connecting the resources in these libraries to those who use or are represented in the collections takes more work and focus than we often realize. Addressing this suggests challenges, commitments, and actions that must be taken to ensure that collections are reaching those who need or want them, in forms and with support that are needed. Attempts to provide a single point of universal access and to welcome everyone into these collections or to imagine potential users as a coherent community, however well-intentioned, may further alienate users from collections and dilute our communication with our users. A collections as data approach provides a path into collections that allows for computational analysis and access unmediated by interface. In preferring collections as data, we must design access to meet the needs of prioritized users. Don't build an API for an introductory digital humanities class experimenting with data cleaning. Don't give Tim Sherritt a comma-separated values spreadsheet for his work to design entirely new interfaces to digital collections. And per the Santa Barbara Statement on Collections as Data, stewards should be intentional about who their collections are designed for and work to lower barriers for use. Thank you.